So all muscle contraction depends on ATP, and it can use no other source. An ATP supply depends on the availability of both oxygen as well as organic energy sources such as glucose and fatty acids that can be broken down in the process of ATP production. There are two main pathways for ATP synthesis, which you're probably familiar with. Anaerobic fermentation, or glycolysis from general biology. This enables the cell to produce ATP in the absence of oxygen, but it yields very little ATP and produces this toxic substance called lactic acid, which is a major factor in muscle fatigue. Aerobic respiration produces much more ATP. This was the one that uses the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation. It produces less toxic end products and requires a continual supply of oxygen in order to produce carbon dioxide, water, and plenty of ATP. During the course of exercise, different mechanisms of ATP synthesis are used, depending on the exercise duration. We'll view these mechanisms from the standpoint of immediate, short-term, and long-term energy needs. Now, you have to keep in mind that the muscle doesn't quickly shift from one to the other, like an automatic transmission shifting gears. Rather, these mechanisms are going on all the time and they overlap. It's just about which one predominates during a particular phase or mode of exercise. While we're still before exercise, we're predominantly using aerobic respiration and oxygen from myoglobin to generate our ATP. Up to about 10 seconds, we're using this phosphatogen system, which you may not have met yet, but we'll cover that soon. After about 10 seconds, we move into glycolysis and produce lactic acid during anaerobic fermentation. And after about 40 seconds, we begin to shift more towards the aerobic respiration. This is where we go into long-term exercise, and it's supported by modifications in the cardiopulmonary function. Let's begin by looking in detail at the immediate energy needs. In short, intense exercise, like a 100-yard dash, less than 10 seconds, oxygen need is briefly supplied by oxygen that's stored on myoglobin. And this is for a very limited amount of aerobic respiration at the instant onset because we're already doing predominantly aerobic respiration. This is rapidly depleted. The muscles meet most of their ATP demand by borrowing phosphate groups from other molecules and transferring them to ADP. There are two enzymes that control these phosphate transfers. There's myokinase and creatine kinase. Myokinase transfers inorganic phosphates from one ADP to another, converting the latter into ATP. So we make one ADP over here into AMP, adenosine monophosphate, and we transfer that phosphate to an ADP over here, making it into ATP. In the creatine kinase system, we're obtaining the inorganic phosphate from this phosphate storage molecule called creatine phosphate. We take creatine phosphate, take the phosphate off it, and make it ATP. We generate creatine and ADP. So now we have just a little bit of ATP available for immediate exercise. This is why people take creatine supplements sometimes, because having creatine in there means you have more creatine phosphate potential, and thus you have a little bit more energy for these instant burst activities. That's why it seems to be effective in weight training. However, what are the consequences? This would be a great topic if someone wanted to take it on for their end of semester presentation. What are the benefits and dangers of creatine? What does it do? We already know that it increases the hydration state of the cell. Is this dangerous when it comes to the heart? Is it dangerous when it comes to the lungs? Pick it up as a topic and tell us all about it. ATP and creatine phosphate are collectively called the phosphagen system. They provide nearly all the energy used for short bursts of intense activity. Now let's take a look at short-term energy needs. After the phosphagen system is exhausted, the muscles shift into anaerobic fermentation in order to buy time until the cardiopulmonary function has caught up. The muscles obtain glucose from the blood and their own stored glycogen. In the absence of oxygen, glycolysis can generate a net of 2 ATP for every molecule consumed. That's not very much. It converts the remaining carbons in glucose to lactic acid. The pathway that takes glycogen to lactic acid is called the glycogen lactic acid system, and it produces enough ATP for about 30 or 40 seconds of maximum energy. If you're going to run completely around a baseball diamond or playing basketball, this is the system that's predominantly used. Now, after about 40 seconds or so, the respiratory and cardiovascular system have kind of caught up and deliver oxygen to the muscles. It's coming fast enough for aerobic respiration to meet the needs of aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration produces much more ATP. Thus, this is an efficient means of meeting the ATP demands for prolonged exercise. Very little lactic acid accumulates under steady-state conditions. However, when we bump up the output, we might go back to forming our ATP from glycolysis, and thus we develop a little lactic acid. And as we release that high output interval, we'll return to predominantly oxidative metabolism, where we get 36 ATP per glucose molecule. So it's much, much, much more efficient. The depletion of glycogen and blood glucose, together with the loss of fluid and electrolytes through sweating, sets limits on the endurance performance, even when lactic acid does not. Muscle fatigue is the progressive weakness and loss of contractility that results from prolonged use of the muscles. For example, if you held a dumbbell out at arm's length for a minute, you'd begin to feel your muscles growing weaker, and eventually you'd be unable to hold it up. Fatigue has multiple causes. First of all, ATP synthesis declines as the glycogen is consumed. So we're limited by ATP. When there's not much ATP, the sodium-potassium pumps can't function properly. This compromises their ability to maintain the resting membrane potential and thus the excitability of muscle fibers. Without the sodium-potassium pump working, the cells become hyperpolarized and thus more difficult to stimulate. Lactic acid is involved in fatigue also. It's an acid, so it lowers the pH or makes it much more acidic in the sarcoplasm. This decreased pH inhibits the enzymes involved in contraction, as well as ATP synthesis and other aspects of muscle function. With each action potential, the cell is releasing potassium, and the accumulation of potassium in the extracellular space will cause the cell also to hyperpolarize, which makes the muscle fibers less excitable again. In addition, motor nerve fibers could use up all of their acetylcholine. Without acetylcholine, the motor nerves are not going to be able to stimulate the muscle fibers. This is called junctional fatigue. The central nervous system may also fatigue, which is where all the other motor commands originate. We're not sure why it fatigues, but there does seem to be less signal output to the skeletal muscles when we reach a state of fatigue. The ability to maintain high-intensity exercise for more than 4 or 5 minutes is determined in large part by one's maximum oxygen uptake. This is the point at which the rate of oxygen consumption reaches a plateau and increases no further with added workload. It's usually proportional to body size and peaks around age 20. It's greater in males than in females, but in an endurance athlete, it can be twice as great as an untrained person. It results thus in twice as much ATP production and thus greater endurance. By training, we can increase our maximum oxygen uptake. We can do this by exercising at aerobic levels and then doing interval training. You take it up for 1 or 2 minutes to a very high output using predominantly the anaerobic mechanisms of ATP production. We train our body to get very efficient at this level, and it really, really wants to be more efficient and use the aerobic pathways. So the more we challenge it by pushing it into the anaerobic zone, the more that it'll increase the aerobic threshold so that we have greater aerobic capacity and thus higher endurance. So, when you've had a period of high exertion, you've probably noticed that the heavy breathing continues after that strenuous exercise. This happens because your body has accrued an oxygen debt, which needs to be repaid. So by inhaling more oxygen, we're paying off that oxygen debt. That oxygen is used to replace the oxygen reserves that we depleted in the first minute of exercise. We're going to restock the myoglobin with oxygen and the hemoglobin in the blood. Oxygen is going to be dissolved in blood plasma and other extracellular fluid, as well as restoring the normal oxygen levels in the air in the lungs. Also, we'll be replenishing the phosphagen system. We're synthesizing ATP and using some of it to donate phosphate groups back to creatine, until the resting levels of ATP and creatine phosphate have been restored. 80% of the lactic acid produced by muscles enters the bloodstream. It needs to be reconverted into pyruvic acid in the kidneys, the cardiac muscle, and in the liver. So we need to oxidize this lactic acid. Liver converts most of the pyruvic acid back into glucose to replenish the glycogen stores of the muscles. As long as the body temperature remains elevated by exercise, the total metabolic rate is going to remain fairly high. Thus, keeping our metabolism elevated even post-exercise. This consumes more oxygen and thus more ATP and thus more fuel. This is why exercising in the morning is great, because that bumps up your metabolism for the rest of the day and causes consumption of more fuel. So here are some means of beating muscle fatigue. First of all, there's oral creatine that I've discussed in a fair amount of detail so far. This increases the level of creatine in the tissues and thus creatine phosphate, so it increases the speed of ATP regeneration. It's only useful for very high burst type activities like weightlifting. But again, the risks are not well known. Great topic. Carbohydrate loading is also a strategy that's been used to beat muscle fatigue. It packs extra glycogen into the muscles. Basically, your fuel tanks will be extra full. The extra glycogen is hydrophilic, so it attracts water into the cells, thus hydrating the cells more. So it's twofold. There's extra fuel as well as extra water. Not all muscle fibers are alike. They have different modes of metabolism and are adapted to perform different tasks. Some respond slowly, but are relatively resistant to fatigue, while others respond much more quickly, but fatigue very quickly. So each of these primary types of fibers go by multiple names, so it doesn't make it the most easy, but let's begin by looking at slow oxidative muscles, which can otherwise be called slow twitch or type 1 fibers. They're red fibers because they're abundant with mitochondria and myoglobin as well as capillaries. Because they're adapted for aerobic respiration and they're very fatigue resistant. They have relatively long twitches lasting about 100 milliseconds. The soleus of the calf and other postural muscles in the back are great examples of slow oxidative fibers. There are also fast glycolytic fibers, which are also called fast twitch, type 2 fibers, or white fibers. These fibers are white because they lack the myoglobin and mitochondria and as much capillary perfusion. They're well adapted for quick response, but they are not resistant to fatigue. They're rich in enzymes for the phosphagen and glycogen lactic acid systems, and they generate a lot of lactic acid. Now, each muscle has a different ratio of these various fiber types, depending on their function. In addition, individuals have a different proportion of the different fiber types within their muscles, just because of genetic predisposition. We know some people are built to be much better sprinters, while other people are built to be much better long-distance runners. You can see these different classes of muscle fibers when you look at the meat of a chicken. The breast meat is white. It's for flight. It's fast, glycolytic muscle fiber type. It needs to work very quickly. We'll see slow oxidative muscles in the chicken legs and thighs, because the slow oxidative muscles are postural and allow the chicken to walk around, which it doesn't do very quickly very often. Here you can see a micrograph that shows the difference in coloration between slow oxidative and fast glycolytic muscle types. You'll notice that there's a mixture of both fiber types within the same muscle. So we have far more muscle strength than we might normally use. For example, the gluteus maximus can generate 1,200 kilograms of tension, and all the muscles of the body could produce a tension of about 22,000 kilograms or 25 tons. This is much more tension than the bones and the tendons can withstand. This is a fact that accounts for many of the injuries that we see in the calcaneal and patellar tendons. This capacity for strength might help you understand why, when it's really necessary, a mother can lift a car off a baby, a task that seems almost impossible. The strength development in muscles depends on a number of different physiological factors. Now, resistance exercise, such as weightlifting, is the contractions of muscles against a load that resists movement. A few minutes of resistance exercise a few times a week is enough to stimulate muscle growth. Growth is from cellular enlargement and synthesis of more muscle fibers within the cell. It's not from the growth of more muscle cells themselves, just more myofilaments, more actin and myosin inside the myofibrils will allow the muscle to grow thicker. Endurance training, such as jogging and swimming, improves the fatigue resistance of muscles. Slow twitch fibers will produce more mitochondria, be able to store more glycogen, and acquire greater density of blood capillaries. This improves our skeletal strength in general. We'll also see adaptations in the circulatory system. We have an increase in number of red blood cells, thus we have greater oxygen transport capacity. In the lungs, we'll also see increased function, where we're getting greater oxygen exchange across the respiratory barriers. The nervous system also becomes more proficient at coordinating the movements of the exercise. So now that we've reached the end of this section on muscle metabolism, take a moment to review. What are the different energy systems? And how do each of them work? You'll cover the phosphagen system, the glycogen lactic acid system, predominantly glycolysis, and then aerobic respiration. Then review each of the different muscle types: fast glycolytic and slow oxidative. We'll see you for the final section of this chapter, where we look at the cardiac and smooth muscle tissues.